She was the black daughter they erased from family photos, the child they took in but never truly welcomed home. For 25 years, Imani Davis shrunk herself to fit into spaces the prestigious Williams family refused to widen until her parents' funeral revealed a shocking truth no one saw coming. What happens when a lifetime of quiet dignity collides with a posthumous confession that changes everything? This isn't just a story about adoption gone wrong. It's about the courage to reclaim your narrative when the world tries to write you out of it. If you've ever felt invisible in places where you should have belonged, this story will break your heart before putting it back together. Like this video to help others find this powerful message. Leave a comment sharing your own experience with belonging, and subscribe to witness more untold stories that shine light on the shadows we're often too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Stay until the very end to discover how Imani transforms generations of pain into a legacy of healing that nobody could have predicted. The weight of silence is heaviest in rooms full of whispers, and as Imani Davis stood at the back of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Oak Ridge, Connecticut, she could feel 25 years of whispers pressing down on her shoulders like hands trying to keep her in place. The January cold had followed her inside, clinging to her wool coat despite the overheated sanctuary where mourners packed the polished oak pews. Two gleaming urns sewn titanium gray, one alabaster white sat on pedestals at the altar, surrounded by cascading white roses and sterling silver photo frames capturing the smiling faces of Jonathan and Margaret Williams. Pillars of Oak Ridge society. Generous philanthropists. Devoted parents to their two accomplished sons. But not to her. Never really to her. Imani's fingers instinctively reached for the small gold locket hidden beneath her black cashmere turtleneck, the only possession she had from her biological mother. The metal felt cool against her skin, grounding her as eyes darted in her direction, then quickly away. She recognized the familiar pattern. Surprise, confusion, discomfort, dismissal. Is that? I didn't know she was coming. They hadn't spoken in, 10 years? She hadn't planned to come. When the call came about the car accident, Imani had been in her Boston architectural firm, finalizing designs for a community arts center. Her first instinct had been to let the phone ring through to voicemail, just as she'd done every Christmas, every birthday, every Thanksgiving for the past decade. But something, perhaps the same stubborn hope that had sustained her as a child, made her pick up. Now, as the organ's somber notes swelled through the vaulted ceiling, Imani watched her adoptive brothers, Blake and Trevor, receive condolences in the front row. Blake, the investment banker, straight-backed in an impeccable suit, his arm around his quietly weeping wife. Trevor, the surgeon, solemn and controlled, occasionally nodding at well-wishers. Neither had acknowledged her arrival, though Trevor's quick glance backward confirmed they knew she was there. The church smelled of lilies, furniture polish, and old money, the same scent that had permeated the sprawling colonial where Imani had spent her childhood feeling like an exchange student who had long overstayed her welcome. Every Sunday, the Williams family had sat in the third pew at St. Andrew's, picture perfect in their coordinated outfits. Margaret would squeeze Imani's hand during prayers, a gesture that always felt more cautionary than affectionate. Be grateful, Margaret would whisper afterward, straightening Imani's collar as they stood on these same stone steps. Not every girl is so blessed. Blessed. The word had tasted like medicine on Imani's tongue, something you swallowed because you were told it was good for you, even when it made you feel worse. As the minister approached the pulpit, adjusting his glasses with practiced solemnity, Imani felt a strange calm settle over her. In her handbag, carefully folded between the pages of her leather planner, was a letter she had never expected to find words Margaret Williams had written, but never had the courage to say aloud. Words that would change everything. Imani took a deep breath. She had come to say goodbye, yes, but also, finally, to be heard. But the memories had already begun to flood back, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. As the minister droned on about Jonathan Williams' community leadership and Margaret's charitable heart, Imani's mind drifted to that crisp September morning 25 years ago, when a social worker's sedan had pulled into the circular driveway of the Williams estate. She remembered clutching a small backpack containing everything she owned, 2 faded t-shirts, a pair of jeans, and a stuffed elephant missing one eye. "Welcome to your new home, sweetheart," Margaret had said, her smile bright but her eyes appraising, as if Imani were an antique whose value she couldn't quite determine. Jonathan had awkwardly patted her shoulder, his gold Rolex catching the autumn light. "From now on, you're one of us. We don't see color in this house." 7-year-old Imani had nodded, hope blooming in her chest like wildflowers after rain. That first night, Margaret had tucked her into a canopy bed with sheets so soft they felt like sleeping on clouds. She'd placed a kiss on Imani's forehead that smelled of Chanel number 5 and promise. For the first time since her biological mother's death, Imani had fallen asleep without fear. The honeymoon lasted 3 months. "Why does she talk like that?" 10-year-old Blake had asked at dinner, mimicking Imani's pronunciation of certain words, remnants of the inner-city Philadelphia accent she hadn't yet shed. Trevor, 12 and already practiced in the art of subtle cruelty, had snickered behind his napkin. "Boys," Margaret had said, but the warning lacked conviction. Jonathan hadn't even looked up from his Wall Street Journal. That night, Imani had practiced speaking in front of her bathroom mirror, forcing her tongue to flatten vowels into Oak Ridge propriety, swallowing the rhythms that connected her to her first mother. She'd been determined to be perfect, to be worthy of this second chance. Mrs. Chen, her third-grade teacher, had been the first to notice Imani's gift for mathematics and art. "She has a remarkable spatial intelligence," she'd told Margaret during a parent-teacher conference. "Architectural thinking. I've never seen anything like it in someone so young." Margaret had nodded and said all the right things. But later that evening, when Trevor brought home a B+ on a science quiz, the celebration had been effusive. Imani's perfect math scores had remained in her backpack, unmentioned and unexamined. Still, there had been moments fragile, precious moments when Imani had felt almost belonging. The afternoon Margaret had taught her to make Grandmother Williams' famous apple pie, their hands dusted with the same flour. The Saturday Jonathan had built her a drafting table after noticing her sketching buildings on notebook paper. The Christmas Eve, when the family photo had included her, standing slightly off-center but undeniably present. She had clung to these moments like life preservers in an ocean of subtle rejection, had searched for them like water in a desert of indifference. Now, as Blake approached the pulpit to deliver his eulogy, his voice thick with practiced emotion, Imani's fingers again found her mother's locket. Inside was a faded photo and an inscription, "You are seen." Her first mother's promise. Her second family's failure. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had spent her childhood desperately trying to be visible in a home where blindness was considered a virtue. No one in that pristine church knew the truth behind the family portraits that lined the Williams' mahogany-paneled hallway. As Blake's eulogy painted his father as a paragon of fairness and inclusion, Imani's mind wandered to the shadowed corners of her adolescence, the moments that had taught her exactly where she stood in the family hierarchy. She was 13 when the first truly undeniable incident occurred. Margaret's diamond tennis bracelet had gone missing after a dinner party. The house had fallen silent, heavy with unspoken accusation, until Jonathan had cleared his throat and said, "Imani, would you mind emptying your pockets and showing us your room?" No one had asked Blake or Trevor the same question. No one had needed to. The bracelet was later found in the guest bathroom, apparently slipped off during hand-washing. The apology Imani received was perfunctory at best. "We had to check everyone, sweetheart," Margaret had said, though everyone had only ever meant her. By high school, Imani had learned to navigate the Williams estate like a ghost present but unseen, careful not to disturb the family's carefully curated narrative. She excelled academically, throwing herself into architecture and design, finding solace in creating spaces where everything had purpose, where nothing was superfluous or unwanted. "You're so self-sufficient," her guidance counselor once remarked, meant as a compliment. Imani had smiled tightly, unable to explain that self-sufficiency wasn't a choice when inclusion remained elusive. The summer before her senior year brought the annual Williams family vacation to Martha's Vineyard. Imani had packed her suitcase meticulously, including the modest swimsuit Margaret had deemed appropriate. The night before departure, Trevor had walked past her room, pausing at her open door. "Oh," he'd said, feigning surprise, "Mom didn't tell you? The rental only has 3 bedrooms this year. You're staying with Aunt Catherine." Aunt Catherine, who lived in Hartford and collected ceramic frogs. Who had once patted Imani's hair and said, It's actually quite pretty, for what it is. Imani had spent that summer working at the local library, her college application essay practically writing itself as she shelved books and swallowed tears. When her acceptance letter from MIT arrived, full scholarship for architectural engineering, Jonathan had nodded approvingly. "Your people must be very proud," he'd said, as if her achievement belonged to some abstract collective rather than to the family that had raised her. These memories washed over Imani in waves as Trevor now took his place at the pulpit, describing his mother's boundless capacity for love. She watched the congregation nod in solemn agreement. These neighbors and friends who had witnessed her erasure year after year at garden parties, school functions, and charity galas. Who had smiled politely but never questioned why the Williams' adopted daughter gradually disappeared from Christmas cards and conversation. The irony stung like alcohol on an open wound. She had spent years making herself smaller to accommodate their discomfort, only to be rendered completely invisible in their collective memory. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt unseen in spaces where you should have belonged, please hit that like button. Your story matters. Comment below if you've experienced similar struggles or community is listening. Subscribe to hear how Imani finally reclaims her voice in this family that tried to write her out of their story. Sometimes the most powerful act is simply refusing to disappear. The weight of these memories might have crushed someone with a weaker spirit, but Imani Davis had forged her pain into purpose. 10 years had passed since she'd walked away from the Williams family, 10 years of building a life where she defined her own worth. Her corner office at Meridian Architectural Design in Boston featured floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with light the opposite of the shadowed existence she'd endured in Oak Ridge. "Miss Davis, your 2 o'clock is here," her assistant had announced the day she received the call about the accident. Imani had been reviewing blueprints for an affordable housing complex spaces specifically designed to make people feel they belonged. The irony wasn't lost on her. When her phone displayed Williams' home on the caller ID, her first instinct had been to silence it. The last time she'd answered a call from that number had been 7 years ago, when she'd attempted one final reconciliation. Her graduation from summa cum laude featured speaker had seemed significant enough to warrant their presence. She'd sent the invitation with trembling hands and a heart full of fragile hope. They hadn't come. Margaret had called the next day. "We're just so busy with Trevor's residency interviews," she'd explained, her voice light and dismissive. "But we're very proud of you, of course. You've always been so determined." That conversation had been the final cut in a 1,000-cut relationship. Imani had changed her number the following day. Determined indeed to no longer participate in her own erasure. Yet when Blake's wife Jennifer had explained through tears that both Margaret and Jonathan had been killed instantly when their car skidded on black ice, something unexpected had cracked open in Imani's carefully constructed armor. Not grief exactly, how do you grieve people who had never fully allowed you to love them, but something adjacent to it. A mourning for what might have been. For the family that could have embraced her but chose instead to merely accommodate her. "The funeral is Saturday," Jennifer had said, her voice softening slightly. "I thought you should know." After hanging up, Imani had stood at her office window watching Boston's skyline shimmer in the winter light. Each building represented a dream realized, a space claimed. She'd built a life of substance and respect. Partners consulted her on major projects. The Boston Globe had profiled her as one of the city's 40 under 40 visionaries. She had friends who knew her, truly knew her not as an accessory or a charitable act, but as Imani. Brilliant, compassionate, occasionally stubborn, unfailingly loyal. She had no obligation to attend the funeral of people who had treated her as an afterthought. No one would blame her for staying away. She'd rehearsed the decision in her mind, listing all the reasons her absence would be justified. But somewhere beneath the architect's precision and the professional's polish lived the 7-year-old girl who had once believed in second chances, who had once thought love could be earned through perfection, who had once sat on a porch swing, counting stars, and wishing to belong. It was this child who had packed a black dress and boarded the train to Connecticut. This child who now stood in St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, watching strangers mourn parents she had both loved and lost long before their deaths. She hadn't come for closure some wounds resist such neat resolution. She had come for something else entirely. For truth, and truth had found her in the most unexpected way. 3 days after agreeing to help clear out her parents' personal effects, a decision met with transparent surprise from both brothers. Imani had stood in Margaret's immaculate dressing room, methodically sorting silk scarves and cashmere sweaters for donation. The familiar scent of Chanel No. 5 still clung to the fabrics, a ghostly presence that made her hands falter occasionally as she worked. "Take whatever you want," Blake had said earlier, his tone suggesting he couldn't imagine she'd want anything at all. "Jennifer and Rebecca have already selected Mom's important jewelry. Important jewelry as if value could only be measured in diamonds and gold, not in memory or meaning." Imani had nodded, saying nothing. She hadn't come for heirlooms or keepsakes. She'd come because something within her, Sam's stubborn seed of obligation, or perhaps curiosity, wouldn't let her walk away completely. Not yet. It was behind the jewelry box in ornate mahogany case with velvet-lined drawers that she found the first envelope. Her name written in Margaret's elegant script, the ink slightly faded. The shock of seeing those 5 letters, Imani in her adoptive mother's handwriting, had made her sink onto the plush carpet, her legs suddenly unable to support her. For a long moment, she'd simply held the envelope, afraid to open it, afraid not to. What final criticism or passive-aggressive directive had Margaret deemed important enough to preserve? What damage could still be inflicted from beyond the grave? When she finally slid her finger beneath the seal, freeing the carefully folded stationery inside, the first words had knocked the breath from her lungs. "My dearest Imani, I have failed you in ways I am only now beginning to understand." She'd read the letter 3 times in that sitting room, disbelief giving way to a complicated storm of emotions. These were not the words of the Margaret Williams she had known, the woman of carefully maintained appearances and equally careful emotional distance. These were the words of someone awakened to painful truths, someone grappling with regret. "I told myself we were giving you advantages," Margaret had written, "when in reality, we were asking you to pay for them with your identity, your dignity, your sense of belonging. I watched you shrink yourself year after year to fit into spaces we refused to widen. I listened to comments that should have outraged me as your mother and instead cautioned you to be more grateful, more accommodating, less yourself." Behind the first letter, Imani discovered others, a chronicle of Margaret's evolving awareness. Some dated back years, none ever sent. In one particularly painful passage, Margaret described watching Imani graduate from high school, standing apart from her classmates even as she delivered the valedictorian address. "You spoke about building bridges between worlds," she'd written, "and I recognized then that we had forced you to live in the space between, never fully welcomed into ours, disconnected from your origins. What cowardice it took to recognize this truth and still do nothing." The most recent letter, dated just weeks before the accident, contains something that made Imani's hands shake uncontrollably. Tucked between crisp sheets of stationery was a copy of revised estate documents. The Oak Ridge house, the colonial mansion where Imani had never quite belonged, had been left solely to her, along with a trust to maintain it. "I cannot rewrite our history," Margaret had concluded, "but perhaps this can be the foundation for you to write a different future, one where you never again have to make yourself small to belong." As the minister invited the congregation to pray, Imani felt the weight of these revelations pressing against her heart. The posthumous awakening of a mother who had finally seen her too late for reconciliation, but perhaps not too late for truth. Right at that moment, as the minister invited family members to share final remembrances, a silence fell over the congregation. The choreography of grief had been meticulously planned. Blake and Trevor had already spoken. College friends and business associates had offered their condolences, and now the ceremony was winding toward its carefully orchestrated conclusion. No one expected what happened next. Imani rose from her seat in the back pew. The soft click of her heels against the marble floor seemed to echo like thunderclaps in the hushed sanctuary. Every head turned, watching as she moved forward with measured steps. Her spine straight, her gaze unwavering. The air in the church seemed to thicken with collective tension. Blake's head snapped up, his expression shifting from surprise to alarm. Trevor half rose from his seat, as if to intercept her, before his wife placed a restraining hand on his arm. The minister, momentarily flustered by this deviation from the program, adjusted his glasses nervously. Imani felt strangely calm. The letters in her purse seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, a truth too long silenced, finally demanding to be heard. As she approached the pulpit, a memory surfaced: Margaret standing in the doorway of her bedroom the night before Imani left for college, hesitating as if wanting to say something meaningful, but ultimately just reminding her to call when she arrived safely. One of countless missed opportunities for connection, for acknowledgement. When she reached the pulpit, Imani didn't immediately speak. She allowed the silence to stretch, letting those gathered feel a fraction of the discomfort she had carried for decades. She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some concerned, some deliberately avoiding her gaze. These people who had watched her grow up in the periphery of the Williams family, who had witnessed her gradual erasure and said nothing. "My name is Imani Davis," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I was 7 years old when Jonathan and Margaret Williams adopted me." A ripple of murmurs passed through the congregation. Someone in the back coughed awkwardly. "I have spent most of my life trying to be grateful enough, quiet enough, accomplished enough to be worthy of that adoption, to earn my place in a family that never quite made room for me." Her words hung in the air, unembellished and uncompromising. "I didn't come here today to speak ill of the dead. I came to honor a truth that has been buried for too long." She reached into her purse and withdrew Margaret's letter. Not all of them, just the final one. The confession, the awakening. "3 days ago, I found this letter among my mother's possessions." The word mother felt strange on her tongue after so many years of careful distance. "I believe she would want me to share it with you today." Blake's face had drained of color. Trevor stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched beneath his skin. Neither moved to stop her, perhaps out of respect for the setting, perhaps frozen by the sheer unexpectedness of the moment. "My dearest Imani," she read, her voice softening slightly, "as I write this, I am faced with the uncomfortable reality that I have been a coward for most of your life." A collective intake of breath swept through the church. These were not the words they had come to hear, not the sanitized remembrances of a pillar of the community. These were raw, honest words that threatened to unravel the careful mythology the Williams family had constructed. "I watched silently as you were treated as less than, as other, in what should have been your home. I convinced myself that my discomfort in addressing these wrongs was somehow more important than your pain in experiencing them." Tears began to well in Imani's eyes, but her voice remained steady, determined. This was not about performance or vengeance. This was about truth that had been denied to a little girl who had only wanted to belong. "I cannot undo the past," she continued, "but I can ensure that the future honors the daughter I failed to properly see, to properly love." And with those words hanging in the air like a challenge, a promise, and perhaps a benediction, Imani Davis finally claimed the space that had always been rightfully hers. The thunderous silence that followed Imani's revelation lasted only moments before breaking into a storm of whispers. As she folded Margaret's letter and stepped away from the podium, she felt lighter somehow, as if speaking truth aloud had released a weight she'd carried for decades. She hadn't come for revenge or even for justice. She had come for acknowledgement, for the simple dignity of being seen. 3 weeks later, Imani stood on the wide front porch of the Williams estate, watching early spring sunlight filter through dogwood branches. The property keys felt heavy in her hand, a tangible symbol of Margaret's belated attempt at restitution. The attorney had been clear. The house was hers alone, a decision Margaret had finalized just weeks before the accident. There had been no ambiguity, no room for contest, though that hadn't stopped her brothers from trying. "This is preposterous." Blake had sputtered in the lawyer's office, his face flushed with indignation. "She hasn't been part of this family for years." Mother wasn't thinking clearly. "On the contrary, Mr. Harrington had replied, peering over his glasses. Margaret was particularly lucid about this decision. "I tried to suggest dividing the property equally, but she was adamant." The memory of Trevor's cold fury still lingered. "We'll challenge this," he'd threatened, barely looking at Imani. "It's obviously the result of manipulation or diminished capacity." But the additional letters Imani had found dated over years, showing Margaret's evolving awareness, had effectively silenced such claims. Their mother had been neither manipulated nor confused. She had been, perhaps for the first time, completely clear-eyed about the daughter she had failed. The sound of car tires on gravel interrupted her thoughts. A silver BMW pulled into the circular drive, and Trevor emerged, looking uncomfortable in jeans rather than his usual tailored suit. He approached the porch steps slowly, hesitating before climbing. "I told Blake I wouldn't come," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But then I found something in Dad's study." He extended a manila envelope. "It's the original adoption papers. And this." Inside was a photograph Imani had never seen 7-year-old her, asleep on Jonathan's chest during what appeared to be a family movie night. Her small hand curled trustingly against his sweater. "I remember that night," Trevor said quietly. "It was the first time you'd fallen asleep around any of us. Dad sat completely still for hours, afraid to wake you. He said it was the first time you seemed to feel safe." Imani stared at the image, at the tenderness captured there, a moment of connection she had no memory of, evidence of care that had gotten lost in the years of subtle rejection that followed. "We failed you," Trevor said, the words clearly difficult for him. "I failed you." It wasn't a complete apology, not yet. But it was a beginning. "I'm turning the house into a transitional home for foster children aging out of the system," Imani said after a moment. "Kids who need a place to belong while they figure out their next steps." Trevor's eyes widened slightly, then softened with something that might have been respect. "Mother would have." He paused, correcting himself. "No, Mother should have appreciated that." As he departed, Imani returned to the porch, swing the same swing where she'd spent countless afternoons watching the Williams family perform happiness without her. She pushed gently with one foot, setting it in motion, feeling the familiar creak of chains. For the first time, the sound didn't echo with loneliness. Instead, it spoke of possibility, of reclamation, of a space being transformed from a monument to exclusion into a haven of belonging. She wouldn't erase the past, neither the pain nor the rare moments of connection. She wouldn't pretend the letters erased decades of hurt, but she would build something new from the remains of what had been broken. Something truer, something healing. The porch swing creaked gently as Imani Davis, architect, daughter, survivor, closed her eyes and finally, rightfully, felt at home. Imani's journey reminds us that healing rarely follows the path we expect. In turning her childhood home, a place of quiet exclusion, into a haven for foster children aging out of the system, she transformed the narrative from one of rejection to one of radical belonging. The true power in her story isn't just that she received the house in Margaret's will. It's that she chose to create the home she never had for others who need it most. As someone who's witnessed countless stories of family fracture and reconciliation, I can tell you that Imani's courage to speak her truth at that funeral was extraordinary. Not because it exposed the Williams family's failures, but because it offered all of us a mirror to examine our own complicity in the systems that allow some children to remain perpetually other in their own homes. The most profound inheritance isn't property or wealth, it's the ability to break cycles of harm. Margaret's belated awakening came too late for her relationship with Imani, but her daughter's wisdom ensured it wasn't too late for countless other children searching for belonging. What spaces are you holding that could be widened? What voices in your life have you failed to truly hear? These questions aren't comfortable, but neither is growth. If this story touched something in you, please hit that like button so others can find it too. Share your reflections in the comments. Your story matters in this conversation. And subscribe to join our community, where we explore the complex, messy, beautiful truth of human connection through stories that challenge us to see ourselves and others more clearly. Next week's story, about a father's impossible choice during Hurricane Katrina, will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about sacrifice. You won't want to miss it. Remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply refuse to disappear.